All right, here we are in my garden because today we'll be talking about things that have to do with nature a little bit, and also a vision that came about in the garden. We'll be talking about mostly the Philadelphian Society, an interesting group from England in the 17th century that deeply inspired by Burma's work. Now, there was a lot of cross-pollination, I think, going on between England and Germany at this time, as far as religious ideas go. Burma, of course, writing in Germany, his works were almost immediately translated and published in England in translations by John Sparrow and his associates, but mostly Sparrow. And it really kind of transformed English religion to a profound degree. Pardon me. Now, interestingly, the reason this happened is because at this time in England, it was kind of in the middle of the English Civil Wars, and censorship laws were kind of lax. Perhaps at other times, the church would have clamped down on such seemingly heterodox writings as Burma's, and there were a lot of alchemy and other things published as well, Paracelsus. But censors were too busy with war polemic, and this stuff kind of snuck through. Now, interestingly enough, another thing that happened with Burma's inspiration is it kind of took two pathways. One kind of inspired a renaissance of sorts, or maybe not renaissance, but the beginnings of Protestant mysticism. And so it was very a devotional path. And the other side, which I think coupled with the Rosicrucian writings that were coming out around the same time, and the publication of Paracelsus, that there was a kind of scientific or alternative medicine path as well. And we see this, and we'll talk more later, in Robert Flood, for instance, and Thomas Vaughan, and even Henry Vaughan, who, even though he was a poet, he made his living as a physician, a country doctor, but he was practicing what we would now call alternative medicine. Now, in Germany, actually, there's a really pretty decent anthology put together by Arthur Verse Lewis, my friend. Wisdom's Book, and he includes some of the German Behmenists, we could call them. You know, it's people inspired by Burma's work, and took his mysticism as their own, and developed their own insights from this. Now, among those were Gottfried Arnold, Johann Georg Gichtel, and others. And this really contributed to German pietism, for instance. Now, in England, though, in our focus today, it inspired what later became known as the Philadelphian Society. Now, the first among them, and he was not actually a member of the Philadelphian Society because it didn't exist yet, but the origination of that fellowship, we can call it, arose with John Portage. Portage was also a physician, but he was an Anglican priest. And he apparently read Burma as soon as he'd been translated into English and found great inspiration in these writings. And it inspired his preaching. Now, one of his detractors wrote a pamphlet about him saying that he'd left, during a sermon, he started bellowing like a bull and ran out of the church, saying he couldn't go on anymore. Now, this is a detractor who wrote this, and he doesn't seem to be the bellowing bull type of person. What he is, though, is deeply philosophical and theologically devout Anglican. But he's taken into his Anglicanism this idea of Sophia, you know, the missing component, the feminine, in return into Protestantism. Now, I'll just read you a little bit from his book, Sophia. Now, interesting with with Portage, some of his books are lost to us in English. They only appear in German translations. They were translated almost immediately after he wrote them, but the English versions disappeared or never existed at all. Just a couple of his English books survive. In one of his German books, Sophia, which has been translated here, I think, by Arthur, he writes about a new earth. This new earth I saw in myself, a true, essential, independent, firm, and constant earth, in its essence and independence. It was a deep ground. It was firm like a dry land and earthly kingdom upon which to wander. As deep as the visible earth out of this outward birth is, only it is of another nature. It is to the outward eye still invisible. It is not coarsely visible or conceivable, nor is it such a coarse, fat, graspable earth as the visible four-elementary earth of this visible creation. Rather, it is a visible, spiritual, essential, independent, firm earth of itself, spiritually, magically, and philosophically to be understood. That is, this new earth is a spiritual earth, far higher and more united, sublimated, or heartened and spiritualized than the dense, coarse, visible, and graspable earth of this visible creation. And you can see in those words that this idea in Sophiology of perceiving or detecting the glorified nature of creation or of persons or whatever, shining through the visible earth that we see is an important feature. Because the glorification is what Sophia is all about. You're bringing, making God available to us, perceivable to us. Now, another important part with Portage's philosophy of Sophia is he really draws on the idea that we talked with last time with Burma and the glance. So you'll notice in a lot of Burma's illustrations for his text that some of the figures are just filled with all kinds of eyes, right? Because the eye is that through which we take in the world. We talk Thomas Traherne again. But Portage, what's he have to say here? He talks about this essential property of Sophia. She is the revealer of mysteries and hidden wonders of the deity. She is an enlightener of the still eternity. And for Portage as well, this all happens because of the eye of God. The eye of God is that through which is Sophia in a sense. The eye of God is Sophia in a sense because it is through that we enter into God and we're able to perceive and we partake of that. Let me see where's he got it here. Right here. I come now to the next place to speak of, the second, that is, what the nature of the wisdom is. I say then that the divine wisdom is a flowing, moving power, a moving motion immediately proceeding from God's eternal eye. God's wisdom is a bright ray or glance issuing from the eye of eternity. Therefore she is termed the brightness or clarity of the Godhead, and a pure breath or efflux from the majesty of the Almighty. We can say nothing of her, but that she is the brightness and glance of the eye of eternity, who, as she proceeds from the eyes, so she is moved by and only the same. For she is a mere passive, bright, shining virtue, that swiftly passeth through and pierceth all things, by reason of her high purity and subtlety, which can be compared to nothing better than to a lustrous, shining glance, being perfectly passive and moving only according to the motion of the eye of the Father, which makes her more swift and piercing than anything whatsoever. And this is from his book, the major book still available in English, well, I shouldn't say available, that was published in English, is Theologia Mystica. And by the way, I think you can get some of these books on Google Books or archive.org. You can download them for free. So it's probably the only way to try to get some of the Philadelphian books at the moment. That would be wonderful someday if I could put out some edition of some of them. Now, around Portage's group, there was a group of women. And actually, Verse Lewis did us a great service because I think most of them are only available in manuscript. And he put Anne Bathurst, for instance. He has her writing in here, and she was a mystic in Portage's group in London, as well as Portage's wife Mary prior to her death. And this group of women mystics, they would pray and work with Portage, and they would actually pray around the clock, waiting for prophecies and insights, and they lived as a community. It was really kind of beautiful if you think about it. Now, eventually, a widow named Jane Ledd joined this group, and she would in time become the most important figure in the group after Portage. In fact, probably a little bit more important than Portage, though she was very grateful to what he offered her. Ledd came into this group after her husband had died, and she found her home. In fact, her family wanted her to take money from them to help her support because her husband's business partner had squandered all their resources. But she wouldn't do it. She'd rather be poor and free than taken care of and enslaved. So kind of a remarkable woman. She also was remarkable as she became the leader of the Philadelphian Society. Remarkable enough in the 17th century to be a woman, but she had two added burdens. She was going blind. She eventually was completely blind. And she was increasingly obese over the course of her career as a mystic, and which both of those things, the blindness and the obesity, indicate that she suffered from untreated diabetes. And who knows, maybe that contributed to her mystical insights as well. But, and nevertheless, Ledd she's a really remarkable writer. She wrote a book in 1681, wrote a preface to Theologia Mystica of Portage. And then, she probably wouldn't have written much else, but there was a German nobleman who was very much taken with her writing, and he said he would pay for anything she would write to be published. In fact, they were published in both English and German editions, and eventually into Dutch as well. So pretty remarkable figure for this time, and her followers were devoted to her. Two in particular, the Anglican clergyman Richard Roach and Francis Lee, who eventually was a Hebraist or a scholar, theologian, and who eventually married Ledd's widowed daughter. That's a picture of devotion right there. I'll take care of your daughter. So this group around Ledd, the Philadelphians, and there was actually, I should also mention Thomas Bromley, who was one of the first friends of Ledd, and probably, when she became part of the Portage group, Thomas Bromley, who wrote a really wonderful little book called The Way to the Sabbath of Rest, which should be essential reading for spiritual direction. So Ledd became part of this group, and she had these followers, and it's interesting that she modeled herself on St. Paul. We go through her writings, and I wrote about this in my book, Literature and the Encounter with God in Post-Reformation England, the chapter on Jane Ledd. Call it the Pauline mission of Jane Ledd. She really modeled herself on Jane Ledd, and what indicated this to me is Richard Roach, for instance. He wrote some paratexts for some of her books, like poetry or introductions, and he would sign himself Onesimus. And Francis Lee also wrote some paratexts for her, and he would sign himself Timotheus. Now, Timothy and Onesimus were two of the assistants of St. Paul. So I think this indicates that Jane Lead becomes St. Paul. In fact, she does write, she compares herself to St. Paul very often without explicitly saying, I'm St. Paul. So it's super interesting that these gentlemen just followed her. In fact, past her death, they never gave up on her in her project. And the Philadelphian project was a beautiful project. She really wanted to have union between all Christians. It was a totally ecumenical ethos that drove her. She thought Sophia would be the thing to bring all Christians together, and I have to agree. And she also included amongst all Christians the Jews. I mean, she really thought this was important. And as we saw with our recent discussions of Margaret Barker's work, apparently Jane Lead wasn't too far off with this idea of including the Jews as Christians, because they had Sophia first. Now, Lead was part of this Portage group, and her first encounter, I mean, she's a true Sophianic mystic because she met a being called Sophia. And, we don't know if that happened to Burma. We know it happened to Vladimir Soloviev. But not a lot of people have these experiences. And so here's what she writes in her autobiography, which is called A Fountain of Gardens. It's almost 2,000 pages long. It's 3 volumes. It's a big book. But in the very beginning of the book, this is what she writes, published in 1670. Being my lot at that time to visit a friend in a solitary country place, where I had great advantage of retirement, often frequenting lonely walks in a grove or wood, contemplating the happy state of the angelical world, and how desirous I was to have my conversation there, my thoughts were much exercised upon Solomon's choice, which was to find the noble stone of divine wisdom. For by acquainting myself with her, all desirable good in spiritual things would meet upon me. The report and fame that Solomon gave of wisdom did much excite me to seek her favor and friendship, demurring in myself from whence she was descended, still questioning whether she was a distinct being from the deity or no. Now notice, this is all based on her reading of Scripture. She's reading Solomon. Right? This is probably from Ecclesiastes, but also from the wisdom books, which are also attributed to Solomon. And so she continues. Which, while in this debate within my mind, there came upon me an overshadowing bright cloud, and in the midst of it, the figure of a woman, most richly adorned with transparent gold, her hair hanging down, and her face is the terrible crystal for brightness, but her countenance was sweet and mild. At which sight I was somewhat amazed, but immediately this voice came, saying, Behold, I am God's eternal virgin wisdom, whom thou hast been inquiring after. I am to unseal the treasures of God's deep wisdom unto thee, and will be as Rebekah was unto Jacob, a true natural mother. For out of my womb thou shalt be brought forth after the manner of a spirit, conceived and born again. This thou shalt know by a new motion of life, stirring and giving a restlessness, till wisdom be born within the inward parts of thy soul. Now consider of my saying till I return to thee again. And she did have other visions, not lots and lots, but she did have other visions of Sophia. But it did initiate her into a new way of seeing. And what's interesting about Lead is she enjoyed this community, but she was independent enough to think for herself. It's unfortunate that a lot of scholars, contemporary scholars, dismiss her as derivative of Portage, and I don't see that at all. She was not afraid to depart from Portage or Jacob Burma when need arose. She would, if her insights, her spiritual experiences told her otherwise, she would leave him. And she did, and one of the places she did this was on the idea of apokatastasis, which is the salvation of all. And she believed all people would be saved at the end. In this Origin as well, and other people throughout history, Bulgakov, Hans Urs von Balthasar. But when she, this is pretty shocking for a Protestant of this time, and a woman at that. Not only did she uphold the idea of apokatastasis, but connected to that, she upheld the idea of purgatory, which Protestants don't put up with that. But she did. She thought that was God's mercy. That was the way God showed us mercy. But He doesn't want to destroy anybody and send them eternally to hell. So in fact, speaking of the bright crystal, the sun just came out from behind the clouds. It's getting a little bright in here. So these are important moments, I think, in religious history, and especially in the history of Sophia. And as we said before, here's this alternate modernity. So it's kind of parallel to this modernity that was moving forward into the Enlightenment and eventually the Industrial Revolution, computer revolution. But there's this alternate modernity that's maintaining this awareness of Sophia in the world. And next time we'll talk about how this actually impacted the study of science and the engagement with the natural world. So we'll see you then.